Most hardcore. Some of them talk, but lacking in character. How can I relax when it's theft of innocence? The harmless are broken. Oh, what tragedy to meet death with the lost word unspoken. Hide it behind the foundations. Charity constructed house of euthanasia. Architects of house of cards remain hidden behind one noble cause. Extravagant facade masquerading as God. I don't buy it at all. I like the real thing raw. I tell the whole veil off. The lights on or off. I get mine either way. The stellar man in effect. I leave you free and breathless like true psychedelic acceptance. Worldview becomes transcendent. This midnight smoke is so high octane, paralyzing the presence. Hello and welcome everybody to This Week in Tyranny, the most hardcore news show on earth. I am your host Conrad Rogas, and we're coming to you live here on Saturday, October the 14th, exactly 7 days after the Israel-Hamas war broke out. So obviously that will be the topic of this episode, and it will actually be the topic of the next one. I'll do 2 or 3 of these. I was intending to talk about the whole issue in this episode, but it is such a big issue. I have to dedicate more to this. The research itself is taking a lot of time, and there are different aspects, different facets of this that I have to discuss because this is actually a huge issue. So in this episode specifically, we're going to talk about atrocity propaganda. We're going to talk about atrocities. We're going to talk about massacres against civilians, especially. So this will be a hardcore one. I'm going to jump right into it. Now, what is atrocity propaganda? I'm talking about mainstream propaganda that we're hearing from news. It used to be newspapers, used to be radio. Now we're seeing it online. It's still your basic publications that are mass media that are functioning as arms of the government. Basically, it's mainstream propaganda to drum up support for the war machine. It's war propaganda. So anytime you see mainstream news, mainstream articles, even your mainstream podcast hosts, when you hear people talking about the brutality of attacks, when you talk about the violence against children, when they're emphasizing the barbaric nature of attacks, especially slaughtering civilians, right? Using words like slaughter, like massacre. Anytime you hear that, you know that you're hearing some war propaganda. And the reason I say that is because there is so much violence going on against civilians. There are so many human atrocities going on, and there always have been throughout human history. But to get any kind of government to seriously, to get people to really talk about that is pulling teeth. You couldn't get mainstream media or Western governments to recognize things like the Armenian genocide, and that's my first example. The Armenian genocide, which happened during World War I, would not get recognized for 100 years, and it was being denied and denied and denied. There's all this stuff about Holocaust denial, and Holocaust denial is bullshit. That is, I'm going to talk about that in detail. But you hear the ridiculousness of denying actual atrocities that happen. But at the same time, you couldn't get the Armenian genocide recognized. Why? Because of the Turkish influence on Western governments. Now, I know I jumped into this kind of rapid fire, so, just stick with me because I don't want to get bogged down in the details. I really need to get these points across. So, the Armenian genocide, which was done by, it was Turkey, right? It was Turkey back then in World War I. It started in 1914, 1915, and actually it wasn't formally recognized by the United States, for example, until 2019, 105 years after the Armenian genocide. Congress finally officially recognized it. Before then, it was all this propaganda, it was all this kind of euphemistic public relations plays between governments that Of course, governments like the United States were afraid to call the Armenian genocide a genocide because of the Turkish influence, right? It's all about money behind the scenes, foreign policy. This stuff is bullshit. So that's why I'm starting off like this with the Israel-Hamas war. You notice they're calling it the Israel-Hamas war. It's not the Israel-Palestine war, because the propaganda has actually worked so well that they have managed to paint one side of this conflict as a terrorist organization. And I actually just coined this term before I started this show. I'm glad I didn't forget it. The war going on in Israel right now, it is a conflict between two terrorist organizations, Israel and Hamas, two terrorist organizations, at the cost of killing civilians. They're both killing civilians. Right? Civilians are getting killed on both sides. There have been civilians getting slaughtered in the Gaza Strip for decades and decades and decades. Nobody could get that recognized, right? But now, because it's Islamic terrorism, now it's getting all blown up. So I will go into that. Why certain atrocities get highlighted and others get swept under the carpet. So, Armenian genocide, that was one. Western governments swept that under the rug because of the influence of the Turkish government. Then you have things like the genocide in the Canadian residential schools. I'm talking about the killings of indigenous people, especially indigenous children, right? The so-called American Indians. This specifically in Canada I'm talking about. That it came out that the English church and the royal family actually was implicated in all this systematic violence, abuse, and murder and mass burial even of children in the Canadian residential schools. If you want more information about that, you need to look up a documentary called Unrepentant by Kevin Annett. And Kevin Annett has a YouTube channel that to this day, they basically tried to totally demonize him and cancel him and wipe him from the face of the earth. But he spoke the truth, and he has all the testimony, and to this day, he's on YouTube. He's still fighting, right? So those are just two examples of genocides that are real, that just do not get recognized, and they do not get highlighted. Why? Because the narrative does not fit. It doesn't fit the global narrative of the current time. But this does. But let's go back to the beginning of the original massacre, the original event that begun this Israel-Hamas war. And this was, of course, the Re'im Music Festival massacre on Saturday, October 7th. Right at sunrise, you had Hamas, you had these terrorists basically perform a mass execution of over 250 people, 260 people, right? And this is now the largest terror attack in Israel's history. The biggest massacre on Israeli land just happened 7 days ago. And even though there's a lot of talk about it, I'm not sure that has really settled into people's consciousness. This is a big deal, and this is why I will dedicate multiple shows to this. Whereas I didn't even do it with other potentially bigger stories, but this is huge, and there are so many aspects to it. But this deserves to be talked about, and specifically this massacre. This was a massacre. This was a slaughter of civilians, and I have to mention that as well, because people take sides. They take the Israeli side, or they sympathize with the Palestinian side. I personally, just to let the viewers know, I've always sympathized with the Palestinian side in this, in the past, always. And so has the freedom movement in general. And I tell people this, I think I said this in my last episode, that about 10, 15 years ago, everybody that wanted, the truth movement was exposing the truth about 9/11. It was about, at that time it was the end of George Bush's presidency, so it was 8 years of American conservatist war machine, right? Middle Eastern imperialist policy, right? As increasing surveillance of American citizens, the exercise of the Patriot Act, 2008, you had the recession hit. Now that's not a surprise that right after all these wars happened and invasions, that you had an economic penalty paid by the civilians, of course. Because who do you think fueled the war machine? Who do you think paid Lockheed Martin and all these different groups? It was Lockheed Martin 10 years ago. Now it's, it doesn't matter which which company makes the money, which super corporation, war profiteer makes the money. The money gets made and the people pay the tax. The civilian cost, the price tag is always put on the civilians. On one side, they're getting slaughtered and killed in the streets, and on the other side, they're funding the people doing the slaughtering, right? And then when the retribution comes, 50 years later, it's their children that are dying in the attacks, the people who funded the perpetrators of the massacre. That's how it goes. Now back to this massacre where it was a music festival. Let me give some background on it, right? So it was the Supernova Sukkot Gathering, right? It was called the Supernova Gathering. It was a music festival. It's trance music, psychedelic trance music. This is a music festival organized by a company called Nova, right? So it was called Supernova. Now, let me just throw in some occult breakdowns in the beginning. What is a supernova and what does it symbolize? Because it's actually significant here. This was not only your basic massacre. This was not only an Islamic massacre. On some level, it was terrorism, yes. And it was just an orgy of violence. What it also was is an occult sacrifice, right? Now, what's a supernova? A supernova is an explosion. It happens for one of two reasons. Either it's a natural process of a binary star system where two stars kind of orbit each other, and then one grows massive, and basically there is an imbalance of gas, and in that binary star system the exchange of gas causes an explosion because of the imbalance, right? So the two stars that symbolizes is actually Israel and Palestine, right? This is the dialectic at work. So I'll come back to that. That is one way a supernova can occur, or the classic way to view a supernova is when a star gets too massive and collapses under its own weight. Very massive stars can undergo core collapse. That's what it's called, core collapse. When nuclear fusion becomes unable to sustain the core against its own gravity. Now, what does that mean in relation to this? What is the supernova? What is the core that's going to collapse? It's actually going to be the Western way of life, and specifically America. Because the agenda, the big agenda, is to collapse the American way of life. The American way of life that begun with really natural law begun with individual, sovereignty, self-determination. These are the ideas that catalyze not only going to a new place like America and starting your way of life, not being governed by some type of king over back in Europe, but also it catalyzed the American Revolution. And what that did is it put forth the ideas that basically were the breaking of the chains that enabled people to live for themselves, to pursue their dreams, right? The so-called pursuit of happiness, but really life and liberty. They were able to obtain life and liberty, and basically they created the freest, richest nation, and that's why we're all here, and I'm not in Poland right now. It's because of the American way of life, and that's the supernova that is meant to collapse, because that's what needs to happen in order for this global agenda to be successful. And I'll go back at the end. I'll talk about what the supernova really means, and I'll go back to the Israeli-Palestine conflict in an occult symbolic sense, right? But this festival, where these Hamas guys came in and massacred people, most people don't know that the organizers switched the location of the festival 2 days before. 2 days before. Now, I've been to music festivals, right? You switch the location 2 days before, that's very short notice, right? And this is after the original location in southern Israel did not work out. And the rave was built as a celebration of what? Friends, love, and infinite freedom. This is a quote from them. Friends, love, and infinite freedom. Does that sound like American ideals? Because that's exactly what it is. And that's a supernova that was meant to be collapsed. What was that? It was a slaughtering of people that were just trying to have fun and, just celebrating freedom. I don't care if they're Israeli, American, or whatever. Right? They were enjoying art. right? No matter what type of music it was. And they were slaughtered there. And that's what the system does to us over and over again, regardless of your race, creed, or religion. And that's what happened here. But what's significant about them switching the site? What the significance of that is, how do you coordinate an attack that switched the location 2 days before? All of your intel would be off. So I've done some research. There's actually footage of this. So I haven't mentioned that. I should have mentioned it at the beginning. The way I know that this slaughter occurred, the way people they're saying it did, is because I saw it. You can find the footage of this. There's people with guns and they are shooting people by their cars, executing them. And this is just totally happening. There's all these images from. Now I'll put some of this footage in this video, but I don't know how much I'll be able to put. So if you want some of this first-hand, like actual pictures, right, and footage of this violence, I'll send it to you. I'll email it to you, because I was able to find this stuff, and I'm still doing this research. That happened, but the level of coordination that was planned, you see all the cars on the road, there was like at least 50 trucks, fully armed militants pulling up in this area. This is a level of coordination suitable to engage a military force, but they were shooting at civilians. So they had to be very well coordinated, have very good communication, and have the right information to do this. I've heard it put forward that they just heard the music and then they went there. That's not what happened. It wouldn't have worked out like that. This was a well-planned, well-coordinated attack, because cars surrounded the area to cut people off, and it wasn't just cars. It was trucks, it was motorcycles, and paragliders. Actual paragliders, because, of course, the Gaza Strip is walled off by the most high-tech wall in the world, in human history. They have an underground concrete barrier separating Israel and Egypt from the southern border, separating the Gaza Strip. People don't know this. The Gaza is a prison. It's a prison where there's violence done by Israelis to Palestinians every day. So there's been genocide going on. And now that doesn't mean that this is any less of a massacre. It is a massacre, right? But see, it's a lot to talk about. And I'm trying to go step by step, but how do you explain one thing without explaining all the others? But here we go. I'm just going to continue. We're going to get through this. So, paragliders. For paragliders to go over the Gaza barrier of the barbed wire fence, of course, drones had to drop. There are observation towers. The Israeli Defense Force is so well equipped. Israel gets so much aid from governments, especially the United States. This is a high-tech military force. But regardless of that, you had these guys from the Gaza Strip, which is basically like a prison of poverty. But somehow these guys are fully armed. They have trucks and everything. They're well coordinated. And they're preparing their big assault, right? And instead of focusing on, taking out the Israeli military, they're over here performing this incredible like military mission to kill civilians at a music festival. Now, if that doesn't scream occult sacrifice to you, then I don't know what does, right? So all that happened. It did happen. Did that slaughter occur? Absolutely. It happened. But the level of precision and coordination shows that this was not just a bunch of terrorists from Gaza. They had clear intelligence, and clearly they had assistance from outside the Gaza Strip. Okay? And music festivals, you've seen this happen a few times now, not only in the United States, other places. These festivals have become like an ideal scenario for mass shooting sacrifice rituals. Have you noticed that that's happening more and more often? There are a couple of instances, right? Just like when there are mass shootings here or some sort of other disasters, there are these occult rituals occurring, and they serve not only as catalysts for profit, right, to make profit, to drive foreign policy, to drive economic policy, but also to advance the totalitarian agenda. So it serves multiple purposes of different groups on multiple levels. But they occur at music festivals because that's how you're going to get them in an open field where they have no escape, people that are unarmed, and people who have their guard down. Easy. They want to get those numbers up. This was a systematic slaughter, and you saw that they were looting bodies. I didn't see a force of religious fundamentalists. This was not an energy of revenge or even hatred or some type of religious. This was not jihad. These look like military, paramilitary mercenaries. They look like they were doing it for money, and you could tell, you could see it in their eyes. These guys are here to do a job, right? And that's what they did. Now, to discuss who may have helped them, assisted them in carrying out such an atrocity, you would have to look at who benefits and historically who's involved in these sort of things. And then we're talking about false flag attacks, where we're talking about 9/11, and we're talking about the sinking of the Lusitania in World War I. We got to go all the way back, right? And I will. But this, I mentioned the supernova and the binary star system, and the entire Jewish-Muslim conflict, the history of it, historically, it's an ancient dialectic. It's a symbolic war, actually, between the White and Black Lodge of Freemasonry. The White and Black Lodge. And out of that collision of those two, basically, energies, those two halves of witchcraft, the supernova explosion is supposed to occur symbolically. And what will happen out of that, it will be the integration of the lodges and then the completion of the dark great work. And the dark one great work is the building of a global slavery system. This has always been the plan. This has been the plan of Napoleon. This has been the plan of Alexander the Great. All of these different groups has been the plan of the Bolsheviks. This was Adolf Hitler's plan. Throughout history, all these tyrants, all these people who do the actual massacres and atrocities, they're trying to complete the dark great work because they're occultists, right? And that's the building of a modern slavery system. And if you want to see the symbol of that, you need to flip your dollar bill over, because it's on the back of it. And it's that pyramid. It's a pyramid-based system where everybody's working to keep it up, to basically elevate the singular dark force of this world, which is actually above human beings. It's a superhuman intelligence. And you could call it the force of fear, you could call it Satan, you can call it many things. You could call it the Anunnaki and different types of another interdimensional species even. But I don't go there because that's not significant. I deal with the rational world and what's going on. So I'm going to break down other stories of massacres, and these stories of massacres throughout history, why they've been presented the way they have been, and how they have drawn up, how they have basically fueled and created public support for the war machine to actually do more massacres, more theft of property, more violence, more theft, and ultimately more slavery. So we've been hearing this stuff. Now, I talked about the actual slaughter at the music festival that occurred. That is correct. But the narrative is, the way it's sounding, is that there's all this violence against civilians done by Hamas all over the place. We're talking about babies being decapitated. We're talking about words like barbarism, talking about rape and torture at the hands of Hamas, right? Now this is initially what made me think twice about this narrative when I heard it at first, is I see the atrocity angle is being stressed, and that tells me they're attempting to engage in emotional manipulations to drum up support for Israel. And that's what's going on. And I'll talk about historical examples of this, what is called atrocity propaganda. My first example of this is what is called blood libel. Ironically, originally atrocity propaganda was used against Jewish people. So these are stories, historical stories, like in the Middle Ages, of Jews kidnapping Christian children, drinking their blood, doing all kinds of rituals. Now, the root of these rituals is because dark Kabbalists, right, dark Jewish people who engage in dark Kabbalism do actually do these rituals, and these rituals are done not just by Jewish people, but are done to this day. And then if you want to go into, I won't even mention it because this episode's not about that. But the Podesta emails, the whole Pizzagate thing, yeah, there's a lot of evidence there, right? Not just the church, not just the Christian church, not just dark Judaism, not just Islamic genital mutilation of children. Children are abused all over the world in all different creeds and religions because this whole species is fucked up and it is run by these tyrants who are trying to complete the dark great work, whether they know it or not. If that's too spooky to you, throw out the conspiracy angle, and the reality remains is that these inbred fucks, these Kim Jong-uns, these Hitlers, these little men, soft little men, are getting people to follow them because of this kind of war propaganda and influence, and they're getting people to follow them and engage in atrocities. Let's go back to talking about the atrocities. Now, ironically, Jews were always said to be the terrorists. This has been the narrative for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now why? Because they always had money, so obviously it was easy to paint them as the cause of the world's problems because they had a closely tight-knit religion. On a smaller scale, this was done to Asian people in America, right? In the ghetto, you still have Asian, black on Asian violence, like LA riots. Anytime you have a tight-knit community that's making a little bit of money, it's easy to point the finger at them and get the people to engage in rioting, which creates the support for what? For government control, right? That's the game. So Jews were always said to be the terrorists, and it was bullshit then, and it's bullshit now. Now, it's no secret that many of the global elites are powerful, and they're powerful and influential, and they identify as Jewish. Right, it's clear that Israel is a big player in global policy, right? So I understand the Jewish influence in global policy, right? I understand. But that does not mean that Jews run the world. The ancient religion runs the world. And those people claim all types of different races and religions. What they actually adhere to is Satanism, but who they really are is they're just men of fear and violence. Like I said, they're just men of fear and violence whose interests align. And since their interests align, then therefore they cooperate with each other to increase their individual power respectively and ensure that their violence can perpetrate without consequence. So that was called blood libel. Those were claims of atrocities against Jewish people and then what did you have? You have all types of massacres against Jews. Now, there's your example. Claims of massacres, and then what follows? Actual massacres like the Holocaust and so many others. Then you had, this is an image from the 1641 Irish Rebellion. When that happened, they put forward basically this art of and depiction of what the Irish people did who were rebelling against England. So you had stories of what? Of babies on pitchforks right in front of their mothers, pregnant women having their bellies ripped out. This is the kind of stuff we're hearing about Hamas doing in Israel now, right? It's the same old story. And then later what happened? Oliver Cromwell used this in his little military dictatorship that followed. And what did they do? They massacred the Irish people at the same actual, one of the same actual sites of when this occurred. They killed 2,000 people in a church. They locked up all the priests. They actually burned the church. They burned them all alive in a church. And this is more atrocity propaganda because obviously people see violence being done to babies. There's an emotional reaction and any kind of trepidation to supporting a foreign invasion is gone at that point. So it's just classic. It's classic. Yeah, we should be getting emotional about violence being done to children, but it's actually going on every day, and it's done by people like us, whose skin looks like us, who live next to us, but we don't do shit about it because it actually requires effort, and there's nobody steering some type of established centralized narrative, because people love centralized, neat narratives. They love to listen to bullshit stories, and that's why they listen to these bullshit stories of atrocities that are not occurring, and then they support the actual military of the time, or whatever it might be, and they engage in actual atrocities. Another example, let's keep going. Babes on Bayonets. This is a cartoon from 1914, 1915, right, during World War I. This is when the German army was passing through neutral Belgium to attack France. And then, of course, the U.S. government, it was in their interest, they wanted to go into and join World War I, but there was no support for that. So what did they do? Many U.S. newspapers and magazines featured pro-war cartoons depicting alleged German atrocities in Belgium that did not occur, particularly the killing of innocent women and children. This cartoon appeared in the 1915 edition of the weekly magazine Life. The slaughter in Belgium did not actually occur, but by 1915, tens of thousands of Africans had died in the Belgian Congo, victims of Belgium's ruthless exploitation of the colony's resources. So that sense was thrown in there to say that, people sympathize with the Belgians so much. Meantime, an actual genocide was occurring in the Belgian Congo, not to Belgians by Germans, right? But there's your thing. What, little babies on bayonets? Is this sounding familiar? Because this is the same story we're hearing now. Then more recently, you had the Naira testimony. Now, this was a false testimony given before the United States Congressional Human Rights Caucus on October 10th, 1990. So this is before the Gulf War against Iraq, right? Desert Storm. Naira was a 15-year-old girl who publicly identified by only her first name, and she went to talk to Congress about the Iraqis in Kuwait taking babies out of incubators, unplugging them, taking them out of the incubators and leaving them to die. This is one of the big things that actually created public support for the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq. But in 1992, it was revealed that Naira's last name was al-Sabah, right? And that she was the daughter of Saud al-Sabah. So Naira al-Sabah is actually the daughter of the Kuwait ambassador to the United States. So it was a planned lie in Congress, operation, completely false testimony. Think about that next time you listen to your State of the Union address, where they have like 3 or 4 different civilians or like families, and they clap, they tell them their story. These stories that are put out to the people are bullshit to create support for different types of programs, right? Furthermore, it was revealed that her testimony was organized as part of the Citizens for a Free Kuwait public relations campaign, which was run by the American public relations firm Hill & Knowlton for the Kuwait government. And following this, al-Sabah's testimony has come to be regarded as a classic example of modern atrocity propaganda. And that's what it was, but the damage was done. America went to war with Iraq. Desert Shield happened in 1990. Desert Storm happened in 1991. And that was the Gulf War. Atrocity propaganda again. Now, you also had Saddam Hussein's human shredder. In the years after 9/11, the United States didn't invade Iraq until 2004. So at that time, well, for your first atrocity propaganda was the 9/11 attack itself. But I'll just skip over that. There was a story that Saddam Hussein had basically like a wood chipper, like a human shredder, and he threw his political opponents feet first through this human shredder, and they threw like 30 people in, and they were watching them die. And this was a real story being presented. Ann Clyde wrote in the Times, March 18, 2003, an article entitled "See Men Shredded? Then You Say You Don't Back War." Does that sound like propaganda or what? And was saying that an unnamed Iraqi has said that the Husseins used the shredder to gruesomely kill male opponents, using their shredded bodies as fish food, actually. Later, she would add that it was believed to be housed in Abu Ghraib prison, and spoke with an unidentified person who claimed the shredders were dismantled just before the military got there. So, of course, they never found this human shredder machine. because it didn't exist. So yeah, they must have just gotten rid of it right before the military got there, of course. Two days later, the Australian Prime Minister John Howard made reference to the human shredding machine. So then this stuff is used by politicians, and it becomes kind of part of the public consciousness, and it's just taken as truth. And I see that, this whole story of Hamas just indiscriminately massacring everybody in sight, it's just become basically accepted as truth. But there's a lot more to it. So I've mentioned those stories. Now let's go to some anti-war atrocity propaganda. But the difference with this one is it was actually 100% true and not misleading. So it wasn't actually propaganda. It was just true information. And I put this here to talk about the results of believing in the propaganda they put forward. So this is your danger of supporting Israel or Hamas. This is your danger if you buy any part of the story without doing your research from the standpoint of they are trying to get us to support something, and they're trying to get us to support the war machine. The Israel-Hamas war is a war between two terrorist organizations. We need to stand up to both of them. We need to stand up to the terrorist organizations of the world called government. So this anti-war messaging was called "and babies." And babies? Yes, and babies. Saying that is a reference to what the American military did in the My Lai massacre. In the My Lai massacre, 504 people were killed by American soldiers, by the American army. Yeah, and this is an image of it. It's not men, women, and children. This was a massacre of women and children. Because of course, this was just a village. They had the village just. They were just getting ready for the day. They were cooking. They were preparing, for a regular day. And the men were not there. The men were working or in the military defending their land, right? And initial reports claimed 128 Viet Cong and 22 civilians had been killed in the village during a fierce firefight. So, of course, the propaganda at the time was that this was an actual battle in the military in Vietnam, but that's not what it was. You see in this picture, I hope they don't take it down. You're seeing bodies exposed, but follow this. This was an orgy of violence. They were raping women. They were raping girls as low as 12 years old, as young as 12 years old. That's what happened. It was a complete slaughtering. 500 people. Women and children killed by American soldiers. That's what happens. Stars and Stripes magazine, which was a government magazine, said U.S. infantrymen had killed 128 communists in a bloody day-long battle. Can you imagine? Americans did that shit. That's what happens when you follow war propaganda. That's what they did, because what? They told them that everybody's an enemy. The orders they actually got from one of the commanders, they said, you kill everything that's walking, crawling, or growling. And this is how massacres happen. This happened as recently. Hey, some of these Vietnam vets are alive. These are people's grandfathers. They did this shit. That's why you see they have so much PTSD, because they experienced this recently. I know Vietnam was no joke on either side, because these people that participated in this massacre, they had 30 of their compatriots, of their brothers, die without ever seeing a single enemy. But that's what the fuck happens when you invade somebody's country. So there you go. Don't follow propaganda, because Vietnam had those people. They were defending their land. So when you talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, if you are going to talk about that, which I'll talk about in following episodes, you got to go back to who's getting their shit invaded right now. And really the answer is both. Because yes, these terrorists, whoever they're getting paid by, did cross over and start killing civilians. I've seen so many dead people today just doing this research. It is crazy. But then I see on the Palestinian side now the rockets that are coming across to kill. We hear this. They're shooting the rockets at Hamas settlements. Today I see a baby and they're trying to put the baby back together. It's got their head open like it's a little girl. Babies killed in airstrikes, and they got the doctors just wrapping them up. And so I've seen a lot of war atrocities today, right? But they're happening on both sides. So they're not really going to tell you that. So watch the propaganda. Watching the propaganda, because you motherfuckers are going to push for the My Lai massacre again. Government did the My Lai massacre. Government does all of this. And people who listen to government, don't listen to their bullshit propaganda or religious propaganda, because, by the way, there's no such thing as Holy Land. Holy Land is a bullshit concept. These people are getting their shit invaded by people with guns who are listening to other motherfuckers with guns who are ruled by fear. So, My Lai massacre, Americans did that. And I mentioned the Goran massacre of civilians in the Gaza Strip. And now they've ordered the evacuation of the Gaza Strip. And of course, not everybody's going to evacuate, because those people, an evacuation order is just a threatening, basically a statement that if you don't give us your shit, we're going to kill you. They're getting their shit invaded too. So that's going to happen on both sides now. Massacres of civilians are all done by people who believe state or church propaganda, who believe the fear and the horror stories. They're usually done by members of the military or some kind of paramilitary force, but not always. Sometimes it's just done by people. So that's why I'm saying don't follow the war propaganda. But the bottom line is all slaughters and all genocides are, always were, and always will be carried out by people who listen to a tyrant's propaganda. So I wanted to use this episode to talk about the atrocities, because the atrocities are being stressed right now. Next week, I will talk about the level of organization that is present here. I'll talk about some more of the research I've done, some more of the deeper reaching, the more wide-reaching aspects of this conflict. There is a lot to talk about, and I really think the next episode or two will be very valuable information. And I will be sharing more of this information. Now, I don't know exactly how next week's episode is going to work. I'm going to be out of town, but I'll get it done one way or another. And that one will be about the level of sophistication and organization in Israel on the Hamas side, on the Palestinian side. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you next week on This Week in Tyranny.